Walking in wisdom. We are to do all we can to win the trust and respect of non-Christians without compromising our biblical convictions. Here's Gene to explain.
Daniel illustrates the application of this principle in a marvelous, marvelous way. You see, as we've seen in our studies thus far, he faced a very difficult challenge. He purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself with the meat and with the wine because of its idolatrous associations. But how is he going to communicate that in an environment that is hostile? An environment where he has no choice, basically, as to what he's supposed to do. This was an edict from the king. And so it's really interesting how he handled this as a young man of 15. Notice, in verse 9, Daniel chapter 1, I've called this favor versus fear. God had granted Daniel favor and compassion from the chief official, yet he said to Daniel, "My lord the king, assign your food and drink." I'm afraid of what would happen if he saw your faces looking thinner than those of the other young men your age. You would endanger my life with the king. In other words, he asked for a favor that they would not have to eat the king's meat, but just eat vegetables and take water. And so this very high official said, "Hey, I like you, Daniel. You're a nice kid. But if I do that, I could lose my neck." Nebuchadnezzar is a hothead. We all know that. Things that he does, and what he says is law. And so, I like you, but no, I can't do that. So basically, what happened is that he faced a no. I'm sure that this chief official says, "Look, if I give you just vegetables and water, you're going to work out in the gym every day. You're going to exercise. You're going to develop yourself. You're going to be in long studies day after day. And if the king sees that you're emaciated, that you're not strong and virile, he could take my life." Well, what's Daniel going to do? Well, notice, I call this next principle or section sensitivity and wisdom. Verses 11 to 13. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief official had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, there are two individuals involved. There's the chief official, and then there is the guard. And Daniel approaches the guard. Now, understand that that guard is not going to act on this request without talking over with the chief official. They're going to get in cahoots in relationship to this request. And here's the request. Please test your servants for 10 days, just 10 days, just give us 10 days with vegetables and water. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. In other words, basically these young men said, "Look, if you'll give us this request, then compare us with the other young men that you brought from Jerusalem." And we don't know how many there were, but they were all very brilliant, very strong, very unique, selected, highly selected. Just compare us with the rest and see what happens. Well, I think perhaps what happened is that the guard, as I said, got in cahoots with the chief official, and they said 10 days. If we're careful, we can get by with this. And here I think, and this is speculation, what are they going to do with all this food and all of this wine for 10 days? What do you think they're going to do? They're not going to take it back to the king's kitchen because the report would get back to the king. I think for 10 days they lived royally, these two guys. And they didn't realize that they're going to be able to do that for the next 3 years. Because notice the results. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the diviner priests and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus, and of course that's a projection ahead to his future years involved in relationship to being there in Babylonian captivity. And when it says 10 times better, that's probably metaphorical. You know, you and I, in our language, somebody says, "How you doing?" "Oh, I'm 1,000 times better." Well, 10 times better was hyperbole, but it meant that they were a lot better. They looked better, they were wiser, they were sharper, and so consequently, they were granted this request. And can you imagine the royal feast that the chief official and his family and the guard had for the next 3 years? They had to be very careful with that, by the way. But the thing they had going for them was basically the fact that these guys were brighter, stronger, and certainly the king wouldn't question what was happening. Fascinating story. So, in summary, we have Daniel's wisdom, 15 years old. He sought permission rather than demanding it. Wow, that was wise. We can learn a lot just from that, can't we? Secondly, he understood Aspenaz's hesitancy and fear to grant his request. He understood that. He didn't challenge that. That was very wise. And thirdly, he tried to avoid creating the same tension for his guard. He knew that if the chief official was fearful, the guard would be tremendously insecure about this situation. So we have here a beautiful illustration of wisdom that God had given this young man. And as I think about the New Testament, as I think about the instructions that we have from the Apostle Paul and others in terms of how to behave in this world in which we live, I see some real similarities that relate to Daniel's behavior and his wisdom. For example, 1 Peter 2:12, good works. Peter wrote, "Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles." Now, who are the Gentiles? Here are these Jews. Daniel and his 3 friends, they were Jews. They were not Gentiles. But they are living among the most pagan of Gentiles. And when believers came to Christ in the Roman world, generally speaking, they were living in the midst of Gentiles who were the most pagan in the world. Just read Romans chapter 1 and describes the behavior of the Gentiles at that time in the Roman world. And yet Peter wrote, "Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles so that in a case where they speak against you as those who do evil, they may, by observing your good works, glorify God in the day of visitation." When I think of Daniel and I think of his 3 friends, that respect that they had from the chief official and the guard wasn't something that happened overnight. They behaved honorably in the presence of these men. They won respect, they won trust in order to get permission to do what they wanted to do. I think there's a great lesson there that correlates with the way we as Christians should live in the world in which we live. Secondly, here's another passage, 1 Peter 3, again from the Apostle Peter. Gentleness and respect, but honor the Messiah as Lord in your hearts. Where? In your hearts. What did Daniel do? He purposed in his heart. Always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. However, do this with gentleness and respect, keeping your conscience clear. And I think that probably describes Daniel in this Old Testament setting. Keep your conscience clear so that when you are accused, those who denounce your Christian life will be put to shame. Powerful statement. Here's another one. This one coming from the Apostle Paul. I just call this gracious speech. And again, I think this describes Daniel and how he handled this pagan situation. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders. making the most of your time. All these pagans around them were outsiders. The chief official was an outsider. The guard was an outsider. They were surrounded. And Nebuchadnezzar was a big outsider in relationship to what they believed. And so Paul says, your speech should always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer each person. Which leads to a practical question, and that is, what are some of the opportunities God has given us in our 21st century environment to walk in wisdom in the presence of unbelievers? Well, my mind goes back when I was working on my PhD at New York University. I didn't have one professor that claimed to be a Christian. In fact, they were very liberal, very pagan in their thinking. And yet I had the challenge to sit through those classes, work with them in relationship to working out the assignments and behaving as a believer and yet winning respect with these outsiders, as it were. And I remember that the person who was over my research project, my dissertation, who was not a believer herself, actually advised me towards the end of my studies, which took about 9 years, doing it in the summer at New York University while I was teaching at Moody during the regular year. She actually advised me on how to go into my oral exam and relate to one of the professors who's going to interrogate me regarding my project. Here's an unbeliever sharing with me how to relate to another unbelieving professor who had a reputation of making it really rough on evangelicals, people who believe the Bible. And I look back on that and I say, that's a great opportunity. It was a great challenge. And I believe that this principle really is one that we need to apply in a relationship within the world in which we live, in the workplace. Now, sometimes we face decisions where we have to draw a line in the sand. When we're asked to do things that are absolutely dishonest, wrong, and we can't step over that line. But then we're challenged with the need for wisdom. How do we handle that situation in order to avoid, for example, being fired or having to quit? Now, sometimes that line, if we draw that line in the sand, there's no way for us to be able to win favor. We have to make decisions, and more that's beginning to happen in our culture and society. So we have a tremendous challenge. And whatever that challenge is, I believe this principle is applicable. Here again is what we learn from Daniel. We're to do all we can to win the trust and respect of non-Christians without compromising our biblical convictions.